Throughout history, there's been one pattern that has destroyed every major currency without exception. From the Roman denarius to the German mark, from the Zimbabwean dollar to the Venezuelan bolivar, the sequence is always identical. 5 stages that unfold with mathematical precision, each one leading inevitably to the next, until the currency becomes worthless paper and entire civilizations crumble. Right now, in 2025, the United States dollar is following this exact same pattern. Stage by stage, decision by decision, like we're reading from a script that's been written in blood across 2,000 years of economic history. The evidence is overwhelming. We're not approaching the danger zone, we're deep inside it. Stage 4 is underway, and the signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. The national debt has exploded past $37 trillion. Interest payments alone consume over $1 trillion annually. The dollar has lost 10% of its value in just the first half of 2025, the worst performance since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Foreign nations are dumping treasury bonds at record rates. Our credit rating has been downgraded by every major agency. And the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between allowing inflation to spiral out of control or raising interest rates so high that the government can't service its debt. This isn't economic theory. This is historical fact repeating itself in real time. The same pattern that destroyed Weimar Germany in 1923, that obliterated Zimbabwe in 2008, that's currently finishing off Venezuela, is now targeting the world's reserve currency. And when the dollar collapses, it won't just affect Americans. Every savings account, every pension fund, every retirement plan denominated in dollars will evaporate. The global financial system will implode because 70% of international trade still runs on dollars. But here's what makes this collapse different from all the others. Previous currency failures were contained to single countries or regions. When the German mark died, people could flee to Swiss francs or British pounds. When the Zimbabwean dollar became worthless, citizens switched to US dollars. But when the world's reserve currency fails, there's nowhere to run. Every fiat currency on Earth becomes vulnerable simultaneously. This isn't just another economic crisis. This is the end of the monetary system that's governed global trade for 80 years. Let me show you how this pattern works by walking through the 5 stages of currency collapse, how they played out in history, how they're playing out right now, and what stage 5 looks like when it arrives. Because understanding this pattern isn't just academic curiosity, it's survival information for anyone who wants to protect their wealth and their family from what's coming. Stage 1 is fiscal irresponsibility. This is where governments begin spending far more than they collect in taxes, running persistent deficits that require constant borrowing to fund basic operations. The debt grows faster than the economy, but politicians dismiss concerns because the currency still functions normally. Citizens trust their money, international partners accept it for trade, and markets continue buying government bonds. The problem is invisible to most people because the consequences haven't manifested yet. Weimar Germany entered stage 1 after World War I. The government faced impossible reparation payments to the Allied powers, while simultaneously trying to rebuild a devastated economy. Tax revenues couldn't cover even basic government functions, let alone the billions in war reparations. So they borrowed, constantly, from foreign banks, from domestic institutions, from anyone willing to lend. By 1921, German government debt had reached levels that made repayment through normal economic growth mathematically impossible. Zimbabwe hit stage 1 in the late 1990s when Robert Mugabe's government began massive land redistribution programs. They seized productive farms from experienced white farmers and redistributed them to political supporters who had no agricultural training. Food production collapsed, manufacturing declined, tax revenues plummeted, but government spending increased as they tried to maintain social programs and military operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The budget deficit exploded, but the Zimbabwean dollar still functioned normally. International observers worried, but most citizens remained confident in their currency. Venezuela entered stage 1 during Hugo Chávez's presidency in the 2000s. Despite massive oil revenues, the government spent even more on social programs, subsidies, and corruption. They implemented price controls that destroyed domestic production, making the country dependent on imports, even for goods they previously exported. When oil prices were high, the deficits were manageable, but they built a fiscal structure that required oil at over $100 per barrel to break even. When prices inevitably fell, the government faced impossible choices between cutting spending or expanding deficits. The United States completed stage 1 decades ago. We've run budget deficits in 47 of the last 50 years. Our debt to GDP ratio has exploded from 35% in 1980 to over 120% today. We spend more on interest payments than on national defense. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits of $2 trillion annually by 2030, assuming no new spending programs and no economic shocks. These numbers are beyond anything in American history outside of major wars. Stage 2 is monetary accommodation. This is when central banks begin creating new currency to help governments finance their deficits. They buy government bonds with newly printed money, keeping interest rates artificially low and enabling continued fiscal irresponsibility. The money supply expands rapidly, but inflation remains controlled initially because the new currency takes time to circulate through the economy. The German Reichsbank began accommodating the Weimar government in 1921. They purchased government bonds with newly created marks, allowing the treasury to continue spending without raising taxes or cutting programs. The bank's balance sheet expanded rapidly as they monetized more and more government debt. Money supply growth accelerated, but prices remained relatively stable for the first year because people still trusted the currency. Zimbabwe's central bank started printing money aggressively in 2000 to fund government operations and military interventions. They created billions of new Zimbabwean dollars to purchase treasury bills and government bonds. The banking system became a direct extension of fiscal policy, with monetary creation replacing traditional taxation as the government's primary funding mechanism. Venezuela's central bank printed bolivars throughout the 2010s to finance government spending as oil revenues declined. They monetized debt obligations and funded social programs through currency creation rather than fiscal adjustment. The money supply expanded exponentially, but the government maintained price controls that temporarily masked the inflationary impact. The Federal Reserve has accommodated US government deficits through quantitative easing programs since 2008. They've purchased trillions in treasury bonds with newly created dollars, keeping interest rates near zero for over a decade. Their balance sheet expanded from less than $1 trillion in 2007 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. During the COVID crisis alone, they created more dollars than existed in the previous century of American history. Stage 3 is inflation emergence. This is when the monetary expansion from stage 2 begins showing up in consumer prices. Inflation starts gradually, often dismissed as temporary or caused by external factors, but it accelerates as people lose confidence in the currency's purchasing power and begin spending money faster to avoid further losses. German inflation became noticeable in 1922 when prices began rising faster than wages. The government blamed external factors like reparation payments and French occupation of the Ruhr Valley. But citizens started noticing their money bought less food, less clothing, less of everything they needed. Velocity increased as people spent money immediately rather than saving it. Zimbabwe experienced accelerating inflation starting in 2003 as the effects of money printing combined with declining production. Prices doubled annually, then monthly, then weekly. Citizens began converting their money to foreign currency or goods as quickly as possible. The economy shifted toward barter as confidence in the Zimbabwean dollar evaporated. Venezuela saw inflation exceed 1,000% annually by 2017 as years of money printing finally overwhelmed price controls. Citizens lined up for hours to buy basic necessities before prices changed again. The bolivar lost 96% of its value in a single year as people fled to US dollars or other alternatives. The United States is experiencing stage 3 right now. Official inflation peaked at 9.1% in 2022, the highest in 40 years. But real inflation in necessities like food, housing, and energy has been much higher. The dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power since 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility. Citizens are increasingly aware that their paychecks buy less, despite nominal wage increases. Stage 4 is confidence collapse. This is where America stands today. International partners begin questioning the currency's long-term viability. Foreign central banks diversify their reserves. Trade partners seek alternative payment methods. The government faces a choice between allowing inflation to spiral out of control or raising interest rates so high that debt service becomes impossible. The signs of stage 4 confidence collapse are unmistakable when you understand what to look for. It begins with subtle shifts in international behavior that most people miss, but these early indicators accelerate rapidly once the pattern takes hold. Foreign central banks start reducing their dollar reserves not through dramatic announcements, but through quiet diversification over months and years. Trade partners begin negotiating contracts in alternative currencies. International investors demand higher yields to compensate for perceived currency risk. The government's borrowing costs increase even as the central bank tries to keep rates low. This is exactly what's happening to America right now. China has reduced its treasury holdings by over $400 billion since 2021. Japan, traditionally our most reliable bond buyer, has been a net seller for 3 consecutive years. The BRICS nations are developing payment systems specifically designed to bypass dollar-denominated trade. Saudi Arabia, our longest-standing petrodollar partner, has begun accepting yuan for oil transactions. These aren't random policy changes. They're coordinated moves by countries that see the mathematical impossibility of current US fiscal policy and want to reduce their exposure before the crisis hits. The dollar index, which measures our currency's strength against 6 major competitors, has fallen over 10% in 2025 alone. This represents the worst first-half performance since the early 1970s when the Bretton Woods system collapsed and Nixon ended gold convertibility. But unlike previous dollar declines, this one is occurring despite relatively strong US economic growth and higher interest rates. When a currency weakens during good times, it signals fundamental structural problems that will become catastrophic during bad times. Credit rating agencies have downgraded US debt at all three major firms. Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's have all cited unsustainable fiscal trajectories and political dysfunction as primary concerns. These downgrades increase borrowing costs precisely when the government needs to roll over massive amounts of maturing debt. Every percentage point increase in interest rates adds hundreds of billions to annual debt service, creating a vicious cycle where higher rates necessitate more borrowing, which drives rates even higher. The Federal Reserve faces what economists call the impossible trinity. They cannot simultaneously maintain price stability, provide monetary accommodation for government debt service, and preserve the dollar's international status. Something has to give. If they raise rates to combat inflation, the government cannot service its debt. If they keep rates low to enable continued borrowing, inflation accelerates and confidence collapses faster. If they try to maintain the dollar's reserve status through intervention, they exhaust their credibility and foreign exchange reserves. This exact dilemma destroyed every previous reserve currency in history. The British pound faced the same impossible choice in the 1960s and 1970s. They tried to maintain sterling's international role while running unsustainable fiscal deficits and accommodating monetary policy. The result was the pound's devaluation from $4 to $1.5 over a decade, ending Britain's role as a financial superpower. The dollar's decline will be faster and more severe because the global economy is more interconnected today than it was 50 years ago. Stage 4 accelerates through what economists call reflexivity. As confidence declines, the behavior that decline predicts becomes self-fulfilling. Foreign investors demand higher yields, increasing borrowing costs, which worsens fiscal projections, which reduces confidence further, which drives yields higher still. Currency weakness makes imports more expensive, driving inflation higher, forcing the central bank to choose between allowing price increases or raising rates that bankrupt the government. Each policy response creates new problems that are worse than the original issue. We're seeing this reflexivity in real time. The Treasury's quarterly refunding announcements now move markets because investors question whether there will be sufficient demand for new bond issues. Primary dealer banks, which are required to buy unsold Treasury securities, are approaching their capital limits and may soon be unable to fulfill this function. If a Treasury auction fails to find buyers at any price, confidence will collapse overnight and Stage 5 will begin immediately. The international monetary system is already preparing for dollar failure. Central banks have been accumulating gold at the fastest pace since the 1950s, purchasing over 2,000 tons annually for the past 3 years. Gold represents the only monetary asset that isn't simultaneously another country's liability. When fiat currencies fail simultaneously, precious metals become the ultimate safe haven because they cannot be printed or devalued by government decree. China has been particularly aggressive in gold accumulation, officially increasing reserves by over 300 tons in 2024 alone. But analysts estimate their actual holdings could be 3 to 4 times the official figure when including purchases by state-owned enterprises and military organizations. They're positioning for a post-dollar world where gold backing provides monetary credibility that pure fiat currencies cannot match. The BRICS Development Bank has already begun settling transactions in local currencies rather than dollars. Russia and Iran conduct bilateral trade entirely in rubles and rials. India pays for Russian oil in rupees. These bilateral arrangements are expanding into multilateral systems that could eventually replace dollar-dominated international trade. The network effect that has protected the dollar's reserve status is unraveling as more countries seek alternatives. Technology is accelerating this transition in ways that didn't exist during previous reserve currency transitions. Digital payment systems allow countries to bypass traditional correspondent banking relationships that depend on dollar clearing. Blockchain-based trade finance eliminates the need for dollar-denominated letters of credit. Central bank digital currencies enable direct settlement between monetary authorities without involving American financial institutions. The speed of modern communication means that confidence can collapse in hours rather than months. Social media amplifies every negative development, creating information cascades that can trigger panic selling before policymakers can respond. High-frequency trading algorithms can dump billions in Treasury securities in microseconds if programmed thresholds are breached. The same technology that enabled globalization will accelerate deglobalization when the crisis hits. Military considerations are driving de-dollarization faster than purely economic factors. Countries understand that holding dollar reserves makes them vulnerable to financial sanctions and asset freezes. Russia's experience after invading Ukraine demonstrated how quickly the US can weaponize the international financial system against adversaries. This has motivated even allied nations to reduce their dollar dependence as insurance against future policy disagreements. The timeline for Stage 5 is compressing rapidly. Historical precedent suggests that once Stage 4 confidence collapse reaches critical mass, the transition to hyperinflation occurs within months rather than years. Zimbabwe went from manageable inflation to complete currency failure in less than 18 months. Venezuela's Bolivar lost 99% of its value in under 2 years. The dollar's collapse will be faster because the amounts involved are orders of magnitude larger and the global economy is far more interconnected. Stage 5 represents the final phase where mathematical reality overwhelms political promises and monetary illusions. This is where decades of fiscal irresponsibility, monetary accommodation, and confidence erosion culminate in complete currency breakdown. The government loses control of inflation, the central bank loses credibility, and citizens lose faith in money itself. Society begins reverting to barter systems as the medium of exchange fails to function. When Stage 5 hyperinflation arrives, it doesn't announce itself with government press releases or central bank statements. It explodes into existence overnight, triggered by a single event that destroys the last remnants of monetary confidence. A failed treasury auction, a major foreign creditor dumping their entire dollar position, a geopolitical crisis that forces emergency money printing. The specific trigger doesn't matter because the underlying conditions make collapse inevitable. The mathematics become undeniable. When inflation exceeds 50% monthly, the currency enters what economists call the death spiral. Prices double every few weeks, then every few days, then every few hours. Businesses cannot restock inventory fast enough to keep pace with price changes. Employees demand daily wage adjustments because their paychecks become worthless between pay periods. The velocity of money accelerates exponentially as everyone tries to spend their currency before it loses more value. Weimar Germany experienced this acceleration in 1923 when monthly inflation reached 29,000%. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1918 cost 4 billion marks by November 1923. Workers carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic necessities. Restaurants changed menu prices while customers were eating. Children played with stacks of worthless bills because they were cheaper than toys. The currency became so worthless that people used it as wallpaper and kindling for fires. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation peaked at 79 billion% monthly in November 2008. ATMs couldn't dispense enough cash for a bus fare because the machines weren't designed to handle trillion-dollar withdrawals. The central bank printed $100 trillion notes that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Farmers refused to sell crops for Zimbabwean dollars, preferring to barter for goods or foreign currency. The economy reverted to primitive exchange systems as money ceased functioning. Venezuela's ongoing collapse demonstrates how quickly modern economies disintegrate when currency fails. Inflation exceeded 1 million% annually by 2018, making the bolivar essentially worthless. Venezuelans fled the country in massive numbers, creating the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history. Those who remained survived through barter networks and black market transactions. The government lost control of monetary policy as citizens abandoned the official currency entirely. The American hyperinflation will be different in scale and scope because the dollar's role as the global reserve currency magnifies every effect. When foreign central banks dump their treasury holdings simultaneously, the Federal Reserve will face a choice between allowing interest rates to spike to 20 or 30%, which would immediately bankrupt the government, or creating unlimited new dollars to purchase the bonds that foreign investors are selling. They will choose money creation because political survival demands it. No administration can allow government operations to shut down due to funding shortages. Social security payments must continue. Military salaries must be paid. Interest on existing debt must be serviced. The alternative is immediate political and social collapse, which makes hyperinflation seem like the lesser evil. But printing money to buy unwanted treasury bonds creates a feedback loop that destroys the currency faster than historical precedents. Every new dollar created to purchase bonds increases the money supply, driving inflation higher, which makes existing bonds worth less, forcing more foreign selling, requiring more money creation to stabilize markets. The cycle accelerates until the printing presses cannot keep pace with the destruction of purchasing power. The social consequences will be catastrophic and immediate. Grocery stores will empty within hours as people rush to convert dollars into physical goods before prices rise further. Supply chains will collapse because truckers and warehouse workers cannot afford fuel and food at hyperinflated prices. Utilities will shut down because companies cannot pay employees with worthless currency. The division of labor that enables modern civilization will break down as people focus on basic survival rather than specialized economic functions. The pattern is clear, the timeline is accelerating, and Stage 5 is approaching faster than most people realize. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with mathematical precision. Every empire that followed this path believed they were different, that their currency was special, that the rules somehow didn't apply to them. They were wrong every single time. The question isn't whether the dollar will collapse, but whether you'll recognize the signs before it's too late to protect yourself and your family from what's coming.